Hello. Welcome to Looking at Music Theory Through the Overton Window. I'm your host, Wesley Flinn, but you can call me Wes. So, what are we doing here anyway? Well, unless you've been under a rock these past few years, you know that the field of music theory is grappling with some systemic issues. Curricular issues have been under increased scrutiny since at least 2016 with the College Music Society's manifesto, and I would argue for some time before that. And in terms of the discipline itself, Phil Ewell and others spoke about music theory's white racial frame at the 2019 SMT plenary. In response to that, of course, the Journal of Schenkerian Studies published a controversial issue with responses to Ewell that ran the gamut from serious engagement with the scholarship to, quite frankly, racist and elitist rantings. And since our discipline, if it is to endure, must address these issues, I propose adapting a concept known as the Overton window to help us examine and frame the discussion. Now, the Overton window is named for its creator, Joseph Overton, 1960 to 2003, formerly vice president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, a think tank based in Michigan. The Overton window, in its original form, was designed to help politicians and others understand what political positions were acceptable in the discourse at any given time. The example shown here uh, gives us a range of political positions on education. Now, those above the window, these up here, are considered unacceptable. Anything within the teal area here is considered acceptable in public discourse. These above are considered unacceptable because regulations are too lightly applied. And those down here, below the window, are considered unacceptable because regulation is too heavy-handed. Now, to be sure, Overton and the Mackinac Center had a clear bias toward less regulation, and their goals were always to raise the window so that a more libertarian approach to governance would become more and more acceptable. And by extension, the use of state power, these things down here toward the bottom of the window, as well as the things beyond the window, would become less and less acceptable. Now, I am something of a political junkie. Anyone who knows me can tell you that. So I had a passing familiarity with the Overton window in its original incarnation. And for the record, I harbor rather different views than the creator, but I recognize a useful tool when I see one. Now, as those issues we talked about at the beginning became more and more centered in disciplinary and pedagogical discussions, I began to wonder how this could be adapted for music theory. The first change I made was a physical one of sorts. Rather than moving up or down, my version of the window moves side to side. I decided to focus first on undergraduate pedagogy and curriculum, since that is, for most of us, the most tangible entry point into music theory. So I undertook a study of several different music theory textbooks, ranging from the 1960s to the early 2010s. I made notes of which topics were being covered and what was being emphasized. By doing so, I was able to see how the discipline had shifted, if it indeed had shifted. So let's take a look at what's going on here. The single biggest conclusion I was able to draw from all this was that music theory rarely ejects a concept, at least from a pedagogical standpoint. You can see what I've got here is all the books by name, and then along the y-axis here is the concepts being covered. So tonality, Roman numerals are going to be in most of these, and so forth and so on. So the Overton window for music theory doesn't eject, it doesn't really move in rare cases, but it expands. And on the one hand, this is a testament to the willingness and ability of the discipline of music theory to incorporate new ideas and disseminate them in its pedagogy. On the other hand, it means that our curriculum is becoming quite full. And let's take a look at what we're dealing with here. As you look at things, this is the current window right through here. These things over here are things that are no longer taught. I've got a little asterisk because they're still kind of taught. We just don't use those terms. And then you have all the material in the window here. And then sort of at the far end, we have the things that are recent additions and not yet in it. But one of the things I've gleaned from this is that Again, we don't move the window, we expand it. And that means that our curriculum is becoming quite full, and we run the very real risk of sacrificing depth for breadth. There's a valid argument for that sort of thing at the undergraduate level, but at the same time, we only have so many hours in the curriculum. And as the CMS manifesto discussed, there are real concerns about relevancy here. If a student feels that what we're doing is irrelevant to their goals, uh, because I said so is no longer an acceptable answer. We cannot keep expanding just to expand. At some point, we need to decide what needs to be out of the curriculum or at least diminished greatly so that we have room for other things. Now, I want to know about this process. What does it take to get into the curriculum? So I looked at 3 topics which permeate a lot of our curriculum and research: Schenkerian analysis, dodecaphonic and atonal technique, and Neo-Riemannian transformational theory. I wanted to see how long it took an intellectual idea or analytical technique to travel from existence to acceptance and to opposition. I wanted to see how long it takes for the full discourse to express itself. So with that in mind, let's take a look at 3 topics. First one, Schenker. Schenkerian analysis first appeared in Schenker's own Neue Musikalische Theorien und Fantasien, Volume 1, in 1906. The dates alongside here. By 1917, others were starting to use the techniques. The first appearance of Schenker in a textbook was in 1926, and the first English language articles appeared in 1933. A short 4 years later, we see the first article in opposition to Schenker's ideas by Roger Sessions. Now, it takes until 1962 for Schenker's ideas to become the philosophical underpinning for an undergraduate music theory textbook in total. Earlier, it's part of the textbook. By 1962, it becomes the basis for the textbook. And that's Alan Fort's Tonal Harmony in Concept and Practice. So the path from existence to acceptance to opposition is about 3 decades, with another 3 decades or so for it to move to a central location in music theory and pedagogy. For 12-tone and atonal music, we're looking at about 7 decades for the process. So we'll concentrate 12-tone very specifically here. From its beginnings in the mid-1920s, we see it disseminated widely in the 1930s, and especially after World War II in the 40s and 50s. It became part of the undergraduate curriculum on a consistent basis in the late 1970s. And we see the first textbook devoted completely to atonal and dodecaphonic music around 1980, John Rahn's Basic Atonal Theory. Now, there have been many informal and non-academic statements and polemics in opposition, but the first real scholarly work that takes an opposing tack does not appear until 1991 with William Thompson's Schoenberg's Error. I thought that was fascinating. And the most recent one in the bunch, we'll say, Neo-Riemannian. So transformational or Neo-Riemannian theory takes a little longer to go through the cycle. Riemann first postulates the theories in print in 1914, and then very little happens until 1982, when David Lewin publishes a formal theory of general tonal functions. Now, what we think of as parsimonious voice leading, which has been the point of entry into at least one textbook for Neo-Riemannian theory, first appears in 1995 in Brian Heyer's Reimagining Riemann. And it does not enter the traditional undergraduate curriculum until Miguel Roy Francoli's textbook Harmony and Context comes out in 2003. And then the first real article in opposition to transformational theory, and not in opposition to the theories themselves, but rather to the word is promiscuous use of them, appears only 14 years ago in 2007 with Mike Buckler's Reconsidering Klumpenauer Networks. This whole process takes nearly a century, and transformational theory is still not as widely a part of the undergraduate theory curriculum as are Schenker-derived reductionist techniques and set theory. So we can see that it takes anywhere from 50 to 90 years to move the Overton window. And again, it's more of an expansion than moving. Eventually, we're going to have a reckoning with the sheer amount of material we expect our undergraduates to understand and give a real thought to a complete restructuring of the curriculum. The world is changing and expanding the curriculum alone will not suffice to adapt to these changes. I wanted to then look at the discipline, why the discipline seems to center certain things and treat certain composers and techniques a certain way. So, excuse me, I did a deep dive into Society for Music Theory programs to see which composers were generating research. So for this next section, I figured that the way to do it is to see who's been talked about in SMT. Since SMT is the major scholarly society in the field of music theory, looking at which composers have been studied and presented at SMT would give a sense of disciplinary interest. Now, the data here is from SMT annual meetings from 1978 to 2019, which is pretty much the duration of its existence as an independent society. I want to mention my gratitude to Cynthia Gonzalez of Texas State University in San Marcos for sharing her research with me. It cut down on some of the time for this project, as you might imagine. Having someone else who'd already done a lot of the grunt work of going through a lot of programs did help quite a bit. There are some limitations here. This is only a study of the annual meetings of SMT. If I were to expand this project further, and if there's interest, I certainly would like to do so, I would study regional society meetings as well. I'm editorializing here. I have a slight suspicion that regional societies are less pronounced in their conservatism with both regard to methodologies and composers. And of course, this is strictly by composer, not by technique, although many were grouped under technical or philosophical categories such as Schenkerian analysis or post-tonal analysis. When there are moments of popular groups, like the Beatles, unless it's very specifically mentions which Beatle was the composer in question, I just marked it down generally as the Beatles, as an example. But nonetheless, I believe this process to be a good starting point. This is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end, but it might be the end of the beginning. So what does this data show? Well, first of all, there are a lot of composers we study. Part of that is no doubt due to the nature of academia. If you want to get and keep a gig, yeah, you got to plow new fields. I would hope, though, that part of it is because the Overton window is expanding and a more diverse set of musics is welcome. We definitely see this with popular and vernacular musics, for example, and we're starting to see more from non-Western traditions as well. So by my count, 248 composers have had research about them presented at SMT. 248 is not bad. But many of these composers, where SMT is concerned, can be classified as one-hit wonders. They appear in the annals of SMT precisely one time. So this slide will show the list according to my research. I'll come out of the way here so you can see all the names. And there are some surprises here. Duke Ellington, Adolphus Hellstork, Richard Danielpour, Ralph Vaughan Williams, Pauline Oliveros, Penderecki, for crying out loud, Ellen Tafaz-Willock, right here, bringing up the very end of the list, Ellen Tafaz-Willock. These are not obscure composers, but they are sorely underrepresented at SMT. So now, to answer the question, who is the most presented composer at SMT? The all-time SMT champion. Who do you think it is? Take a couple seconds, lock in your answers, make your wagers. The answer is Arnold Schoenberg, good old Uncle Arnie. I don't think anyone is surprised by this. And we can and will have a discussion about why it's Schoenberg down the road just a bit. So the Overton window for SMT composers looks larger than perhaps the discipline window actually is because of all the one-hit wonders, but certain composers are still centered within it. And if this discipline is to continue to grow and thrive, we're going to have to decenter some composers and center others. And we can center these others by making them more than one-hit wonders. And we can always be on the lookout for other underrepresented composers as well. So we have some information now. What should we do with it? Diversity is the key. We need to have a real discussion about what is needed in the standard undergraduate theory curriculum, or even if there should be a standard undergraduate theory curriculum. And we need to do it quickly. We can't take a century to do it like we've seen with these conceptual ideas. Textbooks are doing a better job of adding new concepts, I'll give them that. But I worry about how in-depth we can go with the new ideas when the textbooks are still skewed toward the standard curriculum. We need to diversify the repertoire as well. Let's take a look at that list of one-hit wonders again. Surely most of these are composers worth exploring further. How on earth are Stephen Sondheim and Libby Larsen on this list? Miot, Mascagni, Todd Rundgren. What is it about our discipline that causes us to avoid music that is popular? I don't mean popular in the vernacular sense. I mean popular in the sense that people listen to it. And yes, I know people listen to Schoenberg. I listen to Schoenberg all the time. I rather enjoy listening to Schoenberg. I think more people should listen to Schoenberg. But the disproportionality of it all, though, should be deeply disconcerting for those of us who wish to see this discipline not just survive, but thrive. There are some excellent resources out there to help in the diversification of repertoire. I'm thinking of the Composers of Color Project, the Music Theory Examples by Women, which is a wonderful website. Those are good starting points. There are many others as well. Now here's where the rubber hits the road. Neither diversification of curriculum nor diversification of repertoire will take hold without a third diversification happening. We need to diversify our analytical techniques. I'm going to say that again. We need to diversify our analytical techniques. I would argue that one of the reasons we like to analyze Schoenberg is because we've been taught how to analyze Schoenberg. Set theory, 12-tone techniques, things like that are pillars of the modern music theory enterprise. You cannot get an advanced degree in music theory without a set theory class, and in most cases, multiple classes. Likewise, Schenkerian analysis, even with the current controversy, is still required before one can consider oneself a music theorist with a capital M and a capital T. And that rhymes with P, and that stands for pool. The problem is that these techniques were designed for very distinct repertoires. And while they often work wonderfully for analysis of those repertoires, well, when all you have is a shtufa, everything starts to look like an Erlenyi. I'm not saying that these techniques can't be adapted and promulgated further. Theorists who work in jazz and improvisation have used reductional analysis to great effect, to cite just one example. But just as a set theory-based analysis of a Haydn symphony would yield a lot of 311-037 with very little information about the construction of the piece itself, our toolkit is limiting both our pedagogy and our repertoire. We need to build a discipline that is more quickly accepting of new ways of looking at music. Now, I'm not calling for a lowering of standards. For the record, the language of the lowering of standards has been for too long a gatekeeping device, often centered around exclusion of race and gender issues, amongst other things. So if anyone interprets what I'm doing as I'm pushing for lowering standards, first of all, I'm not. And second, think about your mindset that is leading you to think that. I do love tenure. What I am calling for is that we allow ourselves to let more approaches in the mix through a shift in how we treat, say, peer review. So if I may be indulged here to talk about the peer review process, let me bring an example from the world of competitive drum and bugle corps. Behind me, you see a still from the 2014 edition of Blue Coats Drum and Bugle Corps, their incredible show Tilt, one of the better shows to never win DCI. And they went on to win a couple of years later, but Tilt really put them on the map of the top tier. It's not a show that could have been done in the early days of drum corps, because in the early days of Drum Corps International, and before that, when it was controlled primarily by the American Legion and other groups, judging was done via what is called a tick system. You started with 100 points, perfect score, and for every mistake that was made, individually or in total, you lost a tenth of a point. Now, the effect of the tick system was to center precision and perfection. And certainly, if you watch old school drum corps, there are some amazingly clean performances, unbelievably clean, unbelievably precise. But it also limited risk taking and expansion of the activity into new and exciting areas. Starting in the 1980s, the judging system began to shift from a tick system to what's called a build-up system. Cleanliness and precision remained important, but judges could award points for taking musical and visual risks, even if the level of performance dropped slightly during the risky moments. Now, as a result of this shift, corps started expanding their repertoire, both musically and visually, pushing the Overton window for the activity in a different direction. Now, we could talk about how audiences respond, how core alumni respond, and then the various pushbacks and things like that. That's beyond the scope of this. But what became apparent was over time, the shows were no less clean or precise, but they were much more creative and adventurous. Getting rid of the tick system didn't lower the standards. It led to more approaches in show design and performance. It gave corps a chance to honor their traditions while still expanding their activity. And that is something that music theory could learn from. We need to do the same in music theory. We need to restructure our peer review mechanisms, the mechanisms that decide what ideas and research get into conferences and publications, to make them more of a buildup than a tick system. But we do that now, I can hear you say. Well, do we? Are we making a genuine effort to move the Overton window? Or are we content to congratulate ourselves when we see Set or Schenker used in analysis of a popular tune, satisfied that that is enough? That's just expanding the repertoire. That's not expanding the analytical techniques, and that is not enough. I'm reminded of an article from the satirical newspaper The Onion. This idea that changing the cover without changing the internal contents will actually change things has been disproven time and time again. This is putting old wine in new bottles, and that is pretty much exactly what the discipline has been doing for far too long. So what do you suggest, Wes? I don't have all the answers. And the point of this enterprise was not for me to say, here's what to do next, here's some analytical techniques that would work, because that would be presumptuous of me. That would make me just as much of a gatekeeper as the traditionalist. The point was to use a different way of looking at the discipline to provide evidence that we are not living up to our own ideals, so that maybe we can make our discipline more inviting, more welcoming, more expansive. I say what I say today because I love music theory. We all are here because we love music theory. Perhaps it is a cliche, but we need to remember, if you truly love something or someone, you tell the truth. This discipline has been fortunate to have some truth told to it lately by Phil Ewell and many, many others. This is why I offer this research and this approach. So, like Inigo Montoya, let me sum up. The Overton window can be a handy device for exploring issues within the discipline of music theory. Once you see theory through the Overton window, however, you are not necessarily going to like what you see. We need to move, not just expand, but move the Overton window so that this discipline can continue to not only be relevant, but adaptive to the needs of all music students. So, if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, angry screeds, whatever, you can send them to me at jwesleyflinn at Morris, or jwflinn at morris.umn.edu, or contact me on Twitter. All the cool kids are doing it at Wes Flinn. So thank you for your time and attention. And here's a little bibliography to whet your appetite. You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.